our governance is quite clear. And that is, we use AI to get the member to a faster yes, to help accelerate in a positive way their health journey. If there's a decision that a physician or a nurse or a pharmacist needs to make, we have that human make that decision, not a machine.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Melissa Flicek. Melissa is the Chief Information Officer of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, the state's oldest health plan that earns roughly $15 billion in annual revenue. Melissa's been in her role for roughly a year, and in that time, she's helped set a more modern technology foundation for the company, invested in a more robust data strategy, and has implemented advances in artificial intelligence. I look forward to hearing more about each of those, among other topics I'm sure we'll cover through this conversation. Prior to her current post, Melissa spent roughly 5.5 years at Optum, where she ended her tenure there as the Chief Technology Officer and Senior Vice President of Consumer Technology and Experiences. Melissa, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. Well, maybe if you don't mind, Melissa, why don't we begin with a description of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota's business? I would imagine most people across the country have a familiarity perhaps with their own Blue Cross Blue Shield organization, but talk a bit about the Minnesota association, if you would, and a bit more about your business.
Right. Well, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota is the only payer in the state that covers all 87 counties. So the entire state. The company is nearly 100 years old. So it's been around a long time. We have lines of business from commercial, so employer paid insurance, to Medicare and retirement, as well as government Medicaid programs. So very robust portfolio.
Yeah, it sounds like it, certainly. Thank you for that. And talk a bit about your role as Chief Information Officer, if you would. What's within your purview?
Right. So I have responsibility for the technology development and support and advancement, as well as data and analytics, which includes AI and facilities. So I have a great purview that includes things like cybersecurity and security operations, as well as our building footprint, which is interesting for us to be able to work across the enterprise.
That's interesting. Yeah, that last bit is certainly not common among your CIO cohorts. Talk a bit about the logic of that combination of the physical part in addition to the digital, the understandable digital responsibilities you have.
Yeah, we found that there's a really nice synergy between the security operations team and facilities, actually. They come together to plan a lot of different events and activities, and it really has worked out nicely.
That's fantastic. Well, as you note, nearly 100-year-old company. You've done considerable work, as I noted at the top, to help set a more modern foundation for the organization. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about some of the initial levers that you've pulled to help do that.
Yeah, a couple of things. My entire background and career, from retail to the medical devices and then into healthcare, has truly been around digital transformation. So this role is interesting for me, which is obviously about putting the member or customer in the center of everything. And so in the evaluation, when I got here, it was really focused on, is our foundation ready for the right member and patient experience? And a big part of that is data. So when we have a member using Blue Care Advisor, our digital tool that they can access and self-serve, or when they're calling into the call center, or when they're working with a sales rep or a broker, that the information is all the same, that it's pulling from the same place, that it's calibrated, that the experience is seamless, that the data is accurate. To me, foundationally, the experience all starts with the data and making sure what we're serving up is meaningful and relevant to the user, or the member in this case, and that it's going to answer their question and be consistent. So that's been a huge part of the member experience and the foundation that we're building.
That's really interesting. And talk a bit about, easier said than done. And so to ensure that there is that common experience across the various channels you talked about, and that foundation of data that you referenced as well. Can you talk a bit about the ingredients to bring that to life, as to make sure that key ingredient, the data itself, is in fact accurate and painting the picture that you just described?
Sure. And what I think is interesting with the multi-industry experience, people are like, oh, it's so different. Yes, parts are different, but I would tell you, Every company I've been at all wants the same thing. One view of customer, one view of price, one view of products, one view of item. Data always comes to the center of these discussions at everywhere that I've worked. But the way we're going at this data foundation is we had multiple data warehouses, multiple ways of pulling the data for some of the deep analytics we do. And we're really consolidating that into a single one copy architecture so that we don't have this replication and the possibility of inaccuracy in that replication or people accessing outdated data. It also eliminates the possibility of duplicate data copies. So we truly are focused on moving and optimizing that data while we move it into a single one copy instance that can then be proliferated across truly any experience or database.
Very, very interesting. And you talk a bit about now that you have set and continue to set a better foundation as you described, some of the broader implications of this in terms of how now you can leverage it in new ways. I know, for example, you are leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning as you've put it to get to a faster yes for the member. Maybe you could talk a bit about what that entails.
Yeah, I think what's really important when we think about, AI, I've been around long enough now where I lived through the times of everything's mobile, then everything's big data, then everything was multi-channel. So we know these terms, but AI is also a very big word. I used to say digital, what meant everything and nothing at the same time. AI is it's a spectrum of events from things like machine learning to predictive modeling to true generative AI, where you start getting into natural language models and so forth. And we're working along that spectrum. But what becomes important and how this foundation will help is we'll feel very confident in building those models on the replication because it's coming from a single place. And when we start validating, it makes that much more simple. If you can think about one of our data warehouses, the data was copied within that data warehouse 11 times. Just within the data warehouse. That's a lot to support. I liken it to a rubber band ball. It takes a big support team, right? Somebody calls and says, my data report doesn't seem quite right. We just start taking off rubber bands to figure out where did it break? What happened? Where did the telemetry fail us? If we get to a single architecture, that becomes a lot simpler because we can leverage automation to do that proactive alerting, find where the issue is, correct the job. And consequently, on something like a generative AI model or a predictive data model, we can actually know this field means this, and it means it across every line of business. And we can pull it in confidently to get to an answer that will make sense for either the member or our customer. So it's a significant progress. And AI governance for me is really important imperative, especially with all the narratives I think out there today around how AI is being used and what people feel about that. I would tell you our governance is quite clear. And that is we use AI to get the member to a faster yes, to help accelerate in a positive way their health journey. If there's a decision that a physician or a nurse or a pharmacist needs to make, we have that human make that decision, not a machine. It's incredibly important to us from a governance perspective that we stay true to that.
Very interesting as you talk about the collaboration between the artificial intelligence, the data, and the people who ultimately make those decisions as well. Can you talk a bit about what you see as some of the fundamental value that you derive from this? It sounds like efficiency is a big part of it, getting to that faster yes. Obviously, that also gets to a patient value in the various ways in which that might be defined more rapidly as well. Is speed an important catalyst? What you're bearing in mind as one of the clear reasons to pursue this to a greater extent?
Yeah, I think leveraging machine learning for both speed and efficiency is critical. And a couple of examples that we've done here. One is we have a product called Blue Ride. So if someone perhaps has a challenge with transportation to and from doctor appointments or whatnot, within many of our plans that is offered, but there's guidance around it. So when they call into customer service, as an example, we built a tool where our customer service agent can ask a question that the member is asking them and get an immediate answer using machine learning with our AI components, which makes the call, it's cut the call by like between 30 and 60% of time, which is great for the member too. We all love to call customer service. I'm kidding. And so to make that call a lot faster is fantastic. I mean, we're also using it for some of our clinical opportunities. So if we think about we have a function called care managers, and if you have a very complex health situation or something you need to navigate as a member, there is a care manager who is a nurse assigned to help you navigate that and be stronger, but through the process, feel more confident through your health journey. And and that's fantastic. But today, the nurse may have to look at 6 different platforms to get all of your clinical information to make sure they're going to reach out and provide you the best guidance. Well, that can take 20 minutes before they even make a call. Now, let's assume that the person doesn't answer the call. Then you're going to your next case and you're doing all that investigation again. So we're currently in the process of creating these clinical summaries, leveraging our AI tools to summarize that so the nurse can read that. It takes less than 5 minutes and quickly make calls so that we can have a much more productive conversation and have it be seamless if we have to go to the next and that person doesn't pick up. I'd love to comment on one that we're doing right now too around predictive modeling. So I think we hear a lot of noise in the out there in the ecosystem around healthcare costs are rising at a cost that's just not sustainable. And we want to be a part of the solution there too. We really want to come together with our ecosystem to help drive down costs of healthcare. And part of what we put together, and it was done in 4 weeks, we put together a great, what I would say, proof of concepts that we'll expand upon that is for our commercial customers. So we show them in using predictive models, here is the amount of cost per member per month of your employees and what we see that trend going over the next 12 months. And by the way, you can click and deep dive into any ailment. You can see here are the top 3 drivers of all of your costs, client X. And here are things we think you can do proactively as a partner to you to minimize those costs and to be much more proactive so that we can change that trend before it happens, which is not something that's widely being done today. Today, it's like, oh, that happened. Those costs are so high. Let's figure out what we do now. We're trying to change the trend while it's happening. And we're using data to do that. And it also dives deep into things like social determinants of health. So if there's people that have a transportation challenges or food insecurity or social isolation, like providing that guidance to an employer to help shape and close those gaps on their side with their employees, I think is a responsible thing to do.
Really interesting. And I appreciate you sharing the specifics of those examples as well. Would love to, you mentioned earlier Blue Care Advisor, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about the methods that's used and the technology behind that also. It sounds like it's woven into some of what you've also described, and an ability for people to access care perhaps or correspond with the company in some meaningful ways. Talk a bit about that.
Right. So it's care in your hand, right? It's care on your mobile app where you can actually see personalized recommendations for you on what, based on really everything that we know about you, your claims, the doctors you see, your condition, your biometrics. It's also scheduling appointments. It's a provider search to find a doctor that will meet your needs. It's a view of your claims. It's the ability to pay your claims. So it's kind of that comprehensive tool to also answer questions about your benefits and eligibility. So it's a way to self-serve and to manage your healthcare in your hand.
And I also want to talk about it, just hearing you speak about the extent to which the organization is proactive in finding ways for patients to avoid costs or for employers to do the same. It strikes me this must be an advantage of, or let's just say a difference between your current environment and past ones, in so much as you're working for a nonprofit? It must be, I'd be interested in your own perspectives of the reorientation of the thinking in a nonprofit environment relative to for-profit companies you've worked for in the past.
It's a really great call out. In the past, this is like an interesting pivot for me in my career. So I've never worked for a nonprofit. I've always worked for a publicly traded company. And, how I like to explain it to my parents who cannot figure out what I do is, before I used to sit at the table and say, okay, but what about the patient? What's in it for the patient? How are we helping the patient? Now it's really fun to play a different role to say, can we make money or meet the costs of doing that? Like I have a very, we have to balance those things to make it sustainable. But I do think it's really important that transparency is injected into the healthcare journey. I went through my own health crisis in 2020. I got and thank God I'm healthy now, but I'm very intimately aware of how complex and broken the system is. If I'm being transparent, I had a benign brain tumor. There was a surgical error. And so I got hydrocephalus, which my spinal fluid was going into my brain. The cut went a little bit deep. I was in the hospital for 21 days. And it was complicated because I didn't quite understand why I couldn't leave. Like there was not really in what I needed to do after, and what I, symptom wise, what I was experiencing, why I was experiencing after when I was recovering. And I really feel like we have to come together as a healthcare community to help patients through their journey. If they're not just simply advocating for themselves and really digging their heels in and saying, I need to understand what I can do to get better, or what's next for me, or what's my journey. I'm not sure it always happens. The system has become so specialized that you have to be your own advocate and drive your own journey to completion to get what you need at times. We have to make that simpler. And so I anchor on patient experience all the time. How can we help them with the next step? How can we help them understand what their total cost could be, or what the risks are of these things? And how do we take the responsible lens of being a really great partner in their journey and not just their insurance company? So that's the lens we take. And that's a key part, I think, of our mission here.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. I'm so sorry for the trials and tribulations you went through, and thank goodness you're better now. But a fascinating story about walking the shoes of your patients by having been one, and living some of the frustrations associated with that, and being able to leverage that experience in meaningful ways to make sure that others don't experience the same frustration that you do. That's a silver lining perhaps to a very difficult situation, that you might forge better experiences for patients since your own experience.
Absolutely. Empathetic lens for sure.
Yeah, well, clearly you have that. Well, I wanted to ask you as well, as I mentioned earlier, many people, even if they're not in Minnesota, would be familiar with Blue Cross Blue Shield and the various networks they might be a part of. And I wonder, to what extent do you collaborate with other CIOs and other Blue Cross Blue Shield organizations? Talk a bit about how learnings are shared or are not, as the case may be, across your peer group.
Right. I think it's a great community, and I'll give you a couple of ways that we leverage it. So the association, the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, so across the states, has a CIO, in my case, the CIO forum that I participate heavily on. So they bring together all the CIOs. We cover certain topics. We have a great conversation. There's also one for CISOs. There's operations as well. But I've leveraged a lot of the CIOs across the country that are, maybe we're doing some foundational data work. We use each other. We bounce things off. Hey, did this work? Where didn't it work? What data was challenging? How did you bring the data together? Where's the linkages? Like, we have incredibly positive conversations that can help us as a community get stronger. And we start to stitch together some of these conversations in terms of, let's say Medicare. How can we come together to understand national data around Medicare from a benchmarking perspective, so that each state can step back and think about how we make our offering stronger? for our Medicare population and as an offering, but also as a service when they already are a member. So we leverage each other. We take advice. I bounce so many solutions off folks. I talk to people that use text, data solutions everywhere. How's it working? Would you still pick it today if you didn't pick it 2 years ago? So it's fantastic collaboration.
It must be remarkable also in as much as the experience and what you're trying to do has an extraordinary amount of overlap, and yet geographically you don't. So it's an unusual situation where comparable businesses that are themselves different and distinct can share so much without the worry of Pepsi giving Coke the keys to the castle, so to say.
Right. It's interesting because the states will have different, guidance and legislation too. If I think about a Medicaid or a government solution, the way Michigan may have guardrails or counsel around that may be totally different than Minnesota. So that's also interesting as we have conversations like, why do you do that? Oh, I do it because of these three regulations. Oh, interesting. We don't have those, but we got to think about that a little bit. So it's interesting.
Well, we've talked about a number of trends that are on the rise and those that you're taking advantage of, many of them associated with data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I wonder, as you look ahead to the year ahead or multiple year view, as the case may be, Melissa, are there other trends that particularly excite you that you would call out that are making their way onto your roadmap?
I mean, I think there are a number of AI startups right now with different VC firms that are incredibly interesting around healthcare. And I think natural language processing is maybe the next trend that will be incredibly powerful and interesting if we can get the machine to be much more interactive like a human. So you don't know I mean, today we call like to get our balance on a credit card or something. It's like, oh, the machine's talking to me. It's going to take forever. But if that can be a natural conversation to accelerate someone getting their answers and having it be in a much more expedient way than it can be if it's a human, I think that's interesting. I also, well, I'll get to my reading item later, but I do think that's a trend that's worth watching and interesting. I also think that, generative AI needs to have a bigger discussion. We implement models today and our partners will say, oh, I can't wait to see the results of my model next month. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We need a lot of data to go through some of those models at times to get to something we're really confident in, right? The data is, and the repetitiveness of the data is what gets us to be able to make decisions quickly. And that can take time. And I don't think that's widely understood. But building on those models, model after model, building on each other, I think is when things will get incredibly interesting to drive some of the generative AI interactions.
Well, you alluded to a question that I also wanted to ask you about, which is, are there anything you've recently read, watched, and or listened to that you would particularly recommend to others?
Yeah, I did recently read the Harvard Business Review. It was all around AI. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, and it was clever because a lot of it was from a business lens and how because a lot of times technologists come at this, right? But if we're not solving business problems, I've seen a lot of great technology that nobody uses. So I love the business lens of it. But I think the biggest nugget that I take away from many of these articles is that you can't remove humans from the artificial intelligence experience. Because when you do, this disconnect becomes a massive risk. And a human needs to make sure there's data there. It's the right data. We've included everything that we should so that there's not the possibility of hallucination. And the less human interaction that you kind of have in that, the bigger risk you have because people start becoming very disconnected from it. And that's not, at the end of the day, what we want.
Oh, good suggestions. All well, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing a great deal from your now roughly a year's worth of experience at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, but also, of course, leavening the conversation with your broader experience across multiple industries. Wonderful to hear more about your journey the accomplishments to date, but also what you foresee in the future as well. Thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.